baseball cap or something.
Good evening. I'm Tom Putnam, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of Tom McNaught, Executive Director of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my library and foundation colleagues, I thank you for coming, welcome those watching on C-SPAN, and acknowledge the generous underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forum's lead sponsor, Bank of America, Raytheon, Boston Capital, the Lowell Institute, the Boston Foundation, and our media partners, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. As you can imagine, the library has been particularly busy recently, approached by thousands of researchers, news organizations, and filmmakers involved in projects to mark the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy presidency. Early on in this process, two inquiries stood out. Scott Stossel, the editor of The Atlantic, informed us of a special commemorative edition devoted to John F. Kennedy. And Susan Bellows of WGBH met with me and others here to discuss a new American Experience documentary, which will be aired later this month. We were pleased to collaborate on both of these efforts, since each made extensive use of our archival collections and were informed by historians, journalists, and activists who have often graced this stage. And we salute the creative genius and the exceedingly high standards of those who work behind the scenes, often doing research and fact-checking here in our reference rooms to ensure the highest quality of both productions. So when we, in turn, were developing this forum to offer a fresh look at the legacy of our 35th president, it occurred to us that it would be interesting to do so in conjunction with both The Atlantic and American Experience. Our time is brief, so we'll dispense with the customary introduction of our speakers. Biographical information for each is provided in your programs, but let me simply express my appreciation to our moderator, NPR's Linda Wertheimer, and to authors Nicholas Lemann and Thomas Mallon, who each wrote a piece in the Atlantic commemorative edition, as did historian Robert Dallek, who has written a new book, Camelot's Court Inside the Kennedy White House. And Professor Dallek is also one of the historians interviewed in the American Experience film, along with my former colleague and friend, Tim Naftali, who is in the midst of writing his own book on President Kennedy. I should note that both the Atlantic Commemorative Edition and Professor Dallek's new book are on sale in our bookstore. Also, we'll be taking written questions from all of you this evening. Lastly, let me make one special note of another of the American Experience commentators, Andrew Young, veteran civil rights activist, friend and supporter of Martin Luther King Jr., former mayor of Atlanta, congressman from Georgia, and President Carter's U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador Young, you honor us with your presence here this evening, and we pause to salute your life of service and contributions to our nation and to our world. We have asked James Bennett, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, and Susan Bellows, series producer at American Experience, to share a few words of welcome before we begin our program. It will be followed by a trailer for the American Experience film, and then Linda Wertheimer will lead our discussion. So please join me now in welcoming Mr. Bennett to our stage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Putnam. I'd also like to thank you for your own contribution to our special issue, an article about the geopolitical significance of President Kennedy's speech in West Berlin in 1963. In this article, by the way, Tom Putnam lays to rest at last the vexing question of whether, in saying "Ich bin ein Berliner," the president was calling himself a jelly donut. He was not to ruin the suspense. I'd also like to thank Tom Mallon for his provocative short story, imagining what might have happened had Oswald at the last minute changed his mind. And I'd like to thank Bob Dallek for his fascinating and fairly terrifying examination of President Kennedy's struggles to rein in a Pentagon all too willing to deploy nuclear weapons. In this issue, we included a mix of new articles and pieces drawn from the Atlantic's archive. We wanted to show how, over the years, new information and a lengthening perspective have revised and really are revising still our views of President Kennedy and of his legacy. Nick Lemann's piece in the issue, a look at whether President Kennedy would have declared war on poverty had he lived, is drawn from the archive. And that piece is as persuasive today as when we first published it in 1988. But that actually can't be said of everything we included in this issue. In fact, we found that looking back at our archive was a sort of a usefully chastening experience, a reminder of the contingency of contemporaneous journalistic and even historical judgments. For example, among the observations that the Atlantic in retrospect may now be judged to have gotten wrong was our statement in 1963 that probably no other declaration had, quote, proved more embarrassing to this president than his eloquent inaugural plea, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. I think it's fair to say that today that is not considered to have been an embarrassing statement. Those sorts of discoveries in our archive were for us also a powerful reminder of the enduring value of this wonderful library, for the access it provides all of us to a living memory of John F. Kennedy. We're grateful, Mr. Putnam, for the library's role in helping us create this issue, and the Atlantic is honored to join with the library and American Experience in developing this forum. And with that, I turn the proceedings over to Susan Bellows with congratulations for producing this beautiful and illuminating film.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, and particularly a pleasure to see so many of you here tonight. And with any luck, you should all be able to make it home to watch the Red Sox work towards their next World Series win, just a few miles away. I'd like to also thank Tom and the rest of the staff here at the library for hosting us. While we were making this film, the library became a kind of second home for the production team as we completed our research in their archives, and it's only fitting that we have one of the film's first public screenings here. There are two other venerable Boston institutions that make the work American Experience does possible. The first is our home station, WGBH, where American Experience began and has been produced for the past 25 years. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank our exclusive corporate sponsor, Liberty Mutual. Their steady and continued support has enabled us to present our work to PBS viewers across the country. At American Experience, we've produced 16 critically acclaimed presidential biographies, but until now, a biography of President Kennedy was not among them. 2 years ago, as we reflected on that absence and reviewed the most recent scholarship on Kennedy's life, as well as newly opened archives, the time seemed right to add him to our library of presidential biographies. JFK offers a fresh assessment of the man, his accomplishments, his setbacks, and his successes. This 4-hour, two-part film premieres nationally on PBS, November 11th and 12th, and tonight I'm pleased to be able to share an advanced look at some clips from the film before we delve into a discussion of the president's legacy with several of the people featured in the film. I hope you enjoy the presentation, and thank you again for joining us. I think first we're going to be seeing a trailer, as we mentioned, I believe.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans
Like many decisions in life, a combination of factors pressed on me, which directed me into my present profession.
There stirred in him a little quiet and maybe even more than quiet rebellion.
Jack didn't know what was wrong with him.
He is burdened by considerable health problems.
There was something in Jack Kennedy, sick as he was, in pain as he was, that made men want to follow him into battle.
They see him as a work in progress.
He taught himself how to be a candidate.
You never defeat the communist movement in Indochina until you get...
I am introducing a resolution.
The United States looks tired. It looks like our brightest days have been in the past.
Jack Kennedy was the most glamorous, attractive president of the United States we've ever had and that we'll ever have.
The Bad Pigs was a total disaster.
As Jackie says, she caught him a couple of times just weeping.
He enlisted the services of a controversial doctor.
This nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
Even though he loves her, it doesn't deter him from having affairs.
Kennedy was engaging in private sexual escapades in the White House.
What you see in the Cuban Missile Crisis is Jack Kennedy pulling the nation back from the edge of war, nuclear war.
All of Kennedy's advisors are against accepting that deal. The only man in the room who thinks this is a way out of the crisis is the president himself.
Some of the faces that you see up here, you'll also see in the American experience. JFK, I was privileged to see the whole thing, and it really is quite remarkable. I must say that I'm thrilled to see so many people here tonight, considering the competing events. And I think special thanks also to the panel. Obviously, remembering the president who died on November 22nd, 1963, there's a whole generation of people who can just rattle off that date. We do remember him, and I think that the fact that the anniversary is so close adds a certain gravity to being here and trying to think critically about the president. We have a number of clips from the American Experience JFK film that sort of deal with important things that happened while he was president and while he was running for president. The first hour spends a great deal of time on his life, his childhood, his education, spending time with his father in London, dealing, looking at the issue of appeasement. He seemed to have been on the edges often, but in places where he saw intense things happening, where he was a witness to extraordinary things, and of course, most notably, I think, the Second World War. Now, what we are going to see here, the first clip, we're just going to go right into them. Instead of asking these eminent gentlemen to speak about their memories of Mr. Kennedy, I think we're just going to go right into the clip and see if we can set some of these things in a context. The first one is the campaign. This is essentially John Kennedy reinventing a presidential campaign.
Jack Kennedy could learn on the run. So he's traveling around the country, and he's seeing that politics is changing. He's learning that the power isn't back in Washington anymore. The power is with these younger people in the States, if he can just line them up. For him, he's learning that the old party machinery doesn't work.
He knows that he's got the money to mount an independent campaign, that he's got the charisma without the help of any party bigwigs or any party establishment to get his photo on the cover of Time and the Saturday Evening Post and Look. He begins a change in American politics that is quite significant. he signals the beginning of a move from party dominance and party candidates to the individual, to the personality who can speak to the people, not through the party, but through television and the mass media directly.
Pleasure to have you here, and I want you to meet my daughter, Caroline, and my wife, Jackie.
Joe Kennedy was nudging every editor he knew in 1959. You want to sell magazines? Put Jack and Jackie on your cover. Jackie Kennedy chafed at the requirement of public display. But when the photographers showed up on the Kennedy doorstep, she did not disappoint.
It used to drive Humphrey nuts because he said, every time I go into the supermarket to go shopping for Muriel, I see Red Book, or I see Good Housekeeping, or I see Saturday Evening Post, all with the Kennedys smiling at me on the cover.
Senator, when are you going to drop this public pretense of non-candidacy and frankly admit that you already are seeking the Democratic presidential nomination in 1960?
Well, Mr. Lawrence, I think there's an appropriate time for anyone to make a decision and a final announcement as to whether he's going to be a candidate.
It seemed to me that there was a sort of perpetual half-smile on his face. There was a sense of joy about what he was doing, that he loved what he was doing.
He's only 43 years old, and a woman says to him, young man, it's too soon. And he says, no, ma'am, this is my time.
I am today announcing my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. The presidency is the most powerful office in the free world. Through its leadership can come a more vital life for all of our people.
Kennedy officially announced his candidacy in January of 1960. Political odds makers put his chances well below Senators Symington, Humphrey, and Johnson.
Thanks for coming today.
All the luck in the world.
Thank you.
And if the old rules applied, Kennedy was surely in trouble. The well-worn path to the Democratic presidential nomination went through the state party chairman and the big city bosses, who still thought they could keep their delegations in line. But Kennedy already had a handful of key players in every state, and a way to show himself a winner: the primaries. The few state primaries were regarded as side events before 1960. Fine for junior senators like Jack Kennedy, but not worthy of serious candidates. Lyndon Johnson sat them out that year.
Johnson stayed in the Senate, stayed as majority leader, told everybody else who was leaving town that they should be ashamed of themselves and they should be back legislating, not speaking.
Johnson's supposition is that he's earned the nomination by dint of his role as Senate Majority Leader. He has very good relations with various party bosses across the country, and that Jack Kennedy is an upstart. Who is this kid who's trying to displace me and take the nomination? I deserve it.
So, Robert Dallek, who is this kid, this upstart? Do you think that was that the sort of national impression of Kennedy?
Well,
or is it just a case of Johnson living in the bubble?
Johnson was living in a bubble. He didn't understand how politics had changed in the country. And that's really saying something because he was such a brilliant politician. But Kennedy bested him in that contest. And, you know, just to say this, as I watch these films, what I'm struck by is how frozen he's in our minds at the age of 46. See, nobody can imagine that he'd be 96 years old today. And, you know, it's not as if he looks like some 19th century figure with a high collar. He's one of us. He still looks like us. Looks like he's part of our culture. And, I mean, I can go on and on about the fact that he has an 85% approval rating. And 1,000-day presidency, how does one account for that? I think it has to do with the presidents who succeeded him. Johnson in Vietnam, Nixon in Watergate, the two Bushes about whom people are not happy, Ford, Carter. And Kennedy is the one who still gives people hope. And he's an inspirational voice. People see him as promising a better day for America. Last point. My teacher was Richard Hofstadter, and Dick once said to me, he said, Bob, you know, America is the only country in history that believes it was born perfect and strives for improvement. and Kennedy is that improvement.
It was an extraordinary, also just from the point of view of politics, he invented a way of campaigning which then has continued. The idea that you run in the primaries, and I must say that I think that the whole thing has sort of become a little bit petrified. The New Hampshire primary, the Iowa caucus, but the most recent election, you might even say that President Obama was taking a bit out of his playbook. He ran as the upstart. He came in from the side, and the Tea Party the same way. The Tea Party absolutely understood what Kennedy did and what Johnson understood. Johnson says in this piece that it's a very few people will vote in the primaries. It's not indicative of anything. Why should we bother with it? And then for the ensuing 50 years, we bothered with it.
I think the president understood television before anybody else did. And I think the thing that makes the difference with President Obama is that he understood the internet and ran a completely different campaign.
Not so bad on TV either.
No, but he was not as good on TV. I mean, Kennedy had because on the stump, President Obama has it. And I first met Senator Kennedy in a parking lot in Chicago, in the middle of Chicago's South Side. And here's this, young kid from Boston up in the middle of 1,000 black people. And they were jumping up and down cheering, and he won them over. Not on anything he said, but just on the fact that you had the feeling here was a brother. This guy was for real. And that won people over.
He was really good at that. I mean, that was one of the observations that you made about him, was that watching him on all of these films that we have of him.
Well, I want to make 2 points. I would like to build on what Ambassador Young said. Kennedy was probably the smartest politico among those running. And that's saying something, because Johnson's a great politico. Johnson was the best legislator. But I don't think that Johnson was as good at understanding politics outside of Washington as JFK. And what does that mean? It means that JFK is actually stumping his own advisors and suggesting moves to make in the election that a number of the closest people to him are saying it's not going to work. One of them is his father. And again, he proves right. His handling of the West Virginia primary, which is so important to his victory, is all him. And he does it. So the thing about John Kennedy that you have to explain is this inner self-confidence that he has, which is so important. Most people would not have tried that. The Obama insurgent campaign makes sense if you know about Kennedy. But give me an insurgent campaign before Kennedy. He was doing something totally outside the box, which I think makes him the first one. The second point I'd like to raise is this issue of change. President Obama did a wonderful job of becoming the change candidate. If you really look at what John F. Kennedy promises in the 1960 campaign, there are not a lot of details. They're not 100-page plans. We're so used to my 47,000-point plan and this plan and that plan. John Kennedy gives you a lot of vague promises, but what the key theme is I'm different. Change. Am I right? I mean, you know this better, but I believe, isn't it true, Bob, that he gives us, I'm going to get America moving again? Isn't that phrase from Kennedy, which we hear all the time, every election now, somebody's going to get us moving again. It's as if we don't move at all, you know, we don't fly, the trains don't work. So Kennedy mastered the skill of becoming the change candidate. And that's what makes the 60 campaign still a playbook that everybody has got to study if they want to be president.
Can I interrupt here and introduce something that normally everybody looks at the phone call that he made as candidate to Coretta King as a game changer. And it was, but nobody knows what happened to Martin Luther King. He had been arrested in a picket line with students, and the students were let go, and they took him to a neighboring county, locked him up. In the middle of the night, they put him in chains, put him in the back of a paddy wagon with a German Shepherd, and drove him 300 miles south to Reidsville State Penitentiary and put him in solitary. Now, Coretta didn't know where he was. None of us knew where he was. And so that phone call, not only, it was his identification with black people struggling. And it was also, though, an opportunity that he got Griffin Bell and Morris Abrams to work behind the scenes to get Martin out of jail. And Martin comes out of jail looking like he'd been at a Tea Party, but that was the only thing he would never talk about. And he really felt that Kennedy had saved his life, because I think that was as close as he'd laugh and joke about being stabbed in Harlem, about his home being bombed, about people, all of his confrontations he could deal with, but he could not deal with what happened in that midnight ride. And he saw John Kennedy as having saved his life and his sanity.
And you know, Ambassador, that all of Kennedy's advisors told him not to make that call.
Except
Harris Wofford.
Except Harris Wofford.
A great man.
Yeah, and Harris had also taken Martin and Coretta to India, I think in '58 or something like that. And so he was seen as a friend of both. And I think that linked them spiritually in a way that never came out politically. But he trusted John Kennedy, and whenever they talked, the president would always pull him off to the side, and they'd have private conversations.
So do you think, did that make a difference electorally, make a difference for him?
Oh, it did, because his Daddy King said, I was worried about this Catholic boy. He said, but I got a whole suitcase full of votes I'm going to throw his way now.
And if I may, I'd like to invoke another sort of specialist of the 1960 campaign. Richard Nixon was convinced that this changed everything. Because in 1968, when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was killed, Nixon understood he absolutely had to go and see Coretta Scott King, and did it.
In talking about him as an agent of change, none of us has mentioned yet, he was the first Catholic to win the presidency.
Yeah.
That's right.
Would Barack Obama be president if it hadn't been for that breakthrough? When we get a woman president, which we will very soon. See, I'm not only a historian, I'm a prophet.
Now, you've written a lot about Irish Catholics in America. I mean, this is your life. But what I was wondering is, did you have any sense of how extraordinary it was that this Catholic boy was running for president?
Yes, we heard about it from the nuns a lot. But one of the things I think was interesting, I mean, 1960, I was 9 during the election, but it's my first real political memory. And I did grow up in an Irish Catholic household, or my father was certainly Irish. But my father was also passionately for Richard Nixon. And I went to the 4th grade every day that fall with a Nixon Lodge experience counts button on, and I used to argue with my fellow 9-year-olds that John F. Kennedy didn't have enough experience to be president. It was an advanced position for a 9-year-old to take. But I think one of the things that, again, Bob mentioned about how the president is always frozen in time at 46 years old for us. We can't see him in any other way except through the mythic, horrific nature of the assassination. And we were proud of the president as a Catholic. I think the high watermark of American Catholicism in some ways was the Kennedy funeral. It was the first time many Americans had ever seen a Catholic Mass. We were tremendously proud of the rituals and the beauty of all of that. But when my father, who had been an Irish boy in Hell's Kitchen, who was astonished to find himself owning a house in the suburbs in the 1950s, just like all the people on the block with us, when they looked at John F. Kennedy, they saw somebody who'd gone to Harvard. They saw somebody whose father had gone to Harvard. When they looked at Richard Nixon, they saw themselves. They saw the striver, the struggler, and they were on their way out of the Democratic Party. They were New Dealers as young men, and they were going to be Nixon's silent majority, and as they got much older, they would be passionate Reaganites. But they did have, I think, a personal attachment to Kennedy, that word we haven't used yet, charisma, and so forth. And just one statistic, in 1964, I looked into this in this town on Long Island. They voted over 60% for Barry Goldwater. Now that's astonishing. Lyndon Johnson carried Republican Nassau County in that election, but this Irish Catholic enclave was over 60% for Goldwater, and yet it was an even higher percentage voting for Bobby Kennedy for the New York Senate. That is, I think, one of the oddest ticket-splitting incidences you can come up with. Goldwater Kennedy. That was the common way that they voted in that town in that year, and it was the vote for Bobby Kennedy that was tribal, that was their grief, that was their Irishness.
You know, one of the things that I think is extraordinary about thinking of the President Kennedy as sort of frozen in time in his mid-40s, is that so was Richard Nixon at that time.
Well, he gets unfrozen, though.
No.
And then gets frozen again.
He never got, well, he got frozen at a terrible time. No, but what I mean, I don't
You mean the
he was
sweating?
Frozen. I meant he was young. He was very young. The two of them were of an age. And somehow we just don't think of him that way.
Well, Richard Nixon? Mm-hmm. Oh. Wait, you mean we don't think of him as young?
We don't think of him. I think most people don't realize
that he was once young?
That the two of them were the same age, essentially, weren't they?
But the thing about it was that Richard Nixon, because of his posture, because of his bad makeup, and the fact that he really had an infected knee, let's not forget there was a reason he was feeling so sick. He looked much older. He didn't have the positive energy that kept, look, it drove Richard Nixon crazy.
That was clear he didn't have that.
No, but it drove him crazy because he didn't have the charisma. I don't think they saw Richard Nixon as a continuation of Eisenhower. And if you were going to vote for Richard Nixon, I believe, you were voting for him because you liked the direction that Eisenhower was taking the country. I don't think you were voting for Richard Nixon because he was a young man, even though he was about Kennedy's age. Yeah. Kennedy came across as the young person, the change agent, the Obama of the time, even though Obama wasn't yet born.
Way not yet born.
No way. It's a year before Obama was born, 1960.
On the national scene, you know, he was a face that people recognized. Kennedy wasn't. You know, he was a minor figure in the Senate in many ways. So I think this whole idea of youth, of change, is very much was at the center of the public's attraction to him.
And back then...
What? Hold on.
Well, go ahead, Ambassador. I'll come in after you.
I was just going to say, back then, the black community was overwhelmingly Lincoln Republicans and had supported Eisenhower. And Eisenhower appointed most of the judges in the South that gave us favorable decisions in the '54 Supreme Court.
Yeah, Nixon courted organized black community a lot as he was preparing to run for president, trying to sort of tap into that tradition. You know, this all gets into the question of Kennedy was for change. People saw that. Change to what? And this is tricky because, you know, it's very hard to understand today because of everything that happened over 50 years that the Kennedy family and John F. Kennedy in particular in 1960 were not all about liberalism as we understand it today. And nor was the Democratic Party necessarily, which included the South as an irremovable part of its coalition. Let me share an unpleasant story, but one that's strong in my memory. I grew up in New Orleans. When President Kennedy was killed, we were in gym class. So we were little kids. I was in 4th grade. Point I'm making is no adult filter yet. And we're in the locker room, and then we heard the news, and everybody cheered. I'm not kidding. And the reason they cheered was that he had recently proposed the Civil Rights Act, which in my world of a segregated white school in the South, people knew as existential threat to everything about our way of life. And then on the other hand, you know, working later as a journalist, what I found, as we all know, President Kennedy had to be kind of pulled into this by the movement, by events, by AIDS. Harris Wofford, who was mentioned earlier, I remember interviewing him years ago, and he told me this sort of surreal story. He's standing on a corner on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington between, you know, Washington was simpler then, between Election Day and Inauguration Day, and JFK sort of glides by in a convertible and pulls over and says, "Harris, get in the car," and gets in. And he says, "Now, just tick off for me, what do I have to do to take care of these problems? Just give me the things I have to do." Meaning race, poverty, ghettos, cities, unrest, segregation, the whole schmear. So it's an interesting story because, which Wofford told me, you know, with admiration, but it's not like Kennedy said, "Okay, I've been elected, I'm having a summit meeting with all the TV cameras blazing, just to plan how this is going to be the centerpiece of my administration."
Yep.
And I don't think he knew at that moment where he wanted to be or where he'd end up.
Just can I add one point, because right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the New York Times sits with Kennedy and sits with Robert Kennedy. And Robert Kennedy sketches out for the New York Times what the domestic agenda would be for 1963 for the Kennedy administration. He doesn't mention civil rights. It's the street that changes it. It's the street that changes it. It's a fantastic story. If you want to see evidence that grassroots movements make a difference, 1963 Birmingham. And the beauty of Kennedy's, of his leadership is his response. But in 1962, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, civil rights was not on his agenda for the domestic policy the next year.
And it's even before Birmingham. It's the Freedom Rides, it's University of Mississippi integration, all that
Let's take a look at a clip which is from the film JFK. This is the civil rights movement. Freedom Riders are going south, and this is about the bus burning. So let's watch it.
Kennedy was always being confronted at the wrong time with the wrong problem. He regards all these things as terrible, you know, competitive distractions.
He learned about the Freedom Riders when he got his New York Times that particular morning, and there was a picture of the bus burning in Anniston, Alabama. And his response was, you know, what the hell is this?
In mid-May 1961, a group of Americans trying to focus attention on the illegal segregation of interstate bus lines in the South ran into more resistance than they'd expected. White supremacists in Alabama had firebombed one passenger bus the protesters were on and beaten them bloody. John Kennedy was 10 days away from a major address to Congress. He was also busy preparing for his historic summit with Nikita Khrushchev, which was just 3 weeks away.
He didn't want America's race problems to be splashed all over the press of the world, and therefore, out of the blue, learning about it, I answer his call on the phone when he suddenly discovers the Freedom Riders are riding into danger. And he said, "Get your friends off those buses. Find a way to stop it."
There's a feeling that the Kennedy administration wants to treat the civil rights movement, generally the Freedom Riders particularly, as an irritant. These are people getting in our way. These are people upsetting our plans. These are people who are taking attention away from what we want to do.
At that time, a Democratic president was totally at the mercy of Southern Democrats. They ran the Congress, and they were segregationists. And he did not want to lose control of Congress over, a few black kids.
That was the battle in 1961 he didn't want to fight. And the president and Robert Kennedy reacted to this by saying, "Not now." It's politically understandable, but historically, it's inexcusable.
Kennedy was wary of sending federal troops to protect the Freedom Riders. He knew it would inflame white Southern Democrats. Justice Department officials called the protest leaders and warned them that the United States government could not assure their safety if they continued, and asked them to stand down.
The optimism that had enveloped the Kennedys, I think, from Election Day forward, began to diminish, and it kept going down and down and down and down and down.
The Freedom Riders refused to suspend their campaign, though they held out little hope of federal protection. "This goddamn civil rights mess," Kennedy complained. He tried to satisfy both sides. He sent his Attorney General brother out to make statements chastising both the Freedom Riders and their attackers. He dispatched a Justice Department aide, a Southerner named John Siegenthaler, to try to keep a lid on the situation, and to explain to local authorities that it was their duty to protect the protesters from the white mobs. This assignment landed Siegenthaler in a parking lot of the Montgomery bus station, where the local police refused to stand between the Freedom Riders and a group of armed and angry segregationists.
There were people there that day who would have killed those kids just because they were black. I mean, they were intent on maiming and crippling and killing. I think the violence visited on the Freedom Riders that day in that Greyhound parking lot in Montgomery shattered those hopes that the administration could somehow navigate through the troubled waters of race in the South. Certainly, they understood that there were going to be problems, but this was one that required federal intervention. This was one that required sending in 400 marshals one afternoon. And once that was done, the idea that you were going to be able to navigate those troubled waters, you realize that was probably a false hope.
Mr. Ambassador, how did you feel about John Kennedy in that period? I mean, you were very young then.
I was not young enough to get on that bus, though. By that time, I had, I guess my third child had been born. And so the SCLC group was, 30 to 50. These were 18 to 25. And we frankly thought it was an unnecessary and unreasonable risk. And Dr. King had not yet recovered from the trauma of his jailing. And the students turned on him because he refused to go. But I think almost none of the preachers in SCLC saw that as as a worthwhile risk of your life. Now, a couple of years later, we did go to Birmingham, which was just as bad, if not worse.
On the bridge and all
But
that.
we had a feeling that we could plan and organize these campaigns. And I think the students had a different strategy. They were trying to come off the college campuses and get into the rural South. And they saw this as a perfect opportunity to get into Mississippi. Now, I was already in Mississippi training people to register to vote, to read. We had a literacy program training leaders to teach their neighbors to register to vote. But it was, our nonviolent confrontation was to send these local people to see their sheriff and explain to their sheriff what they were doing, show him the literature, so invite him to come to the meetings. And we were not into confrontation for confrontation's sake. And that was not true of the students at that time.
But on the other hand, when you see these young people being violently treated, you have to have thought, how can we help? Did you think, what should the president do? That the president should do something?
Well, Dr. King got on the phone with Robert Kennedy, and I think that they worked out, they spent a lot of time talking to each other, and there was a trust, but I think Dr. King understood the president's political situation. And so he was not making demands or threats. He was just explaining the situation and saying, we need your help. Now, the help was coming. And it did come, but we knew that President Kennedy was born and raised in Boston. He hardly knew any black people. And so this was a completely new experience for him.
Bob Dallek?
What I would add to this is that, as an overview, Kennedy was a foreign policy president. He used to say that politics can unseat you, but foreign policy can kill you. However, his greatest strength, getting back to Tim's point, was change, and was the fact that when he came to the office, he did not know where he was going to go exactly. I love the anecdote that Arthur Schlesinger told me, that Bobby Kennedy, after the election, said to him, Arthur, how would you like to be an ambassador? And Arthur said, no, Bobby, if I do anything, I'd like to be at the White House. A few days later, he saw the president-elect, and Kennedy said to him, so Arthur, I hear you're coming to the White House. And Schlesinger said, I am. He said, what will I be doing there? And Kennedy said, I don't know, Arthur. I don't even know what I'll be doing there. But you can bet we'll both be busy more than 8 hours a day. Now, on civil rights, he moved, he came. In '63, when he went before the Congress, or went before the country to put that civil rights bill before the Congress, he was taking, and he and Bobby believed this, a huge risk of not being reelected. They had won that election by a very narrow margin, 118,000 votes. They needed those Southern votes, but they felt this was something that had to be done. It was time, because he spoke to some people and said, these Southerners say they'll change, they'll do things. They never will, and we have to act. And that was, I think, an extraordinary strength, that he could change and respond to the circumstances that were imposing themselves on him.
But he still wanted to be talking about farm. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to add a brief note of historical context. When federal troops were sent by President U.S. Grant to essentially stop the South from misbehaving in some of the ways we've been discussing, there was a meeting at Faneuil Hall in Boston where all the leading liberals of the day who had been abolitionists got up to condemn this unpardonable use of federal power. In 1876, the federal government removed troops from the South. everybody of Kennedy's generation, and even some of our generation, was raised on the idea that Reconstruction, meaning federal troops in the South to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments, had been an utter failure. One chapter in Profiles in Courage by John F. Kennedy was lionizing one of the people who helped overthrow Reconstruction, Senator LQC Lamar. So everybody who was actively in politics and trying to get elected who was white, including Republicans, thought that's where you can never, ever go. It's impossible. And we don't get how impossible it felt to all of them, including Franklin Roosevelt, by the way. And that has to be in your head as you're trying to understand how this unfolds in real time.
But in May of 1963, when the fire hoses start on the children, Kennedy gets so angry, he says, "Now I know how Thaddeus Stevens felt."
Yeah,
the radical, for the first time in his life, he had some empathetic understanding of the radical Republicans in the Reconstruction period.
This is bringing back a memory that you may want to correct, Ambassador Young, of another long ago interview with James Bevel, who's no longer with us. And I spent a long afternoon with him in Chicago. And he said, you know why the kids got the fire hoses? Because we staged that. We knew that would change the nation's mind. And it was a tough decision because we knew if we put the kids there, they'd get attacked. But we did it anyway.
I would disagree with that. Now, Bevel did.
Now, I know he's a little...
No, Bevel trained the kids for D-Day, which was May the 5th. But this was, the hoses came out when Dr. King was arrested. And they were not organized students that we had brought down there. It just happened to be the people, it was on Good Friday, so it was a holiday. Mm-hmm. So there were lots of people in the park. Now, as bad as that looked, I don't think anybody got hurt but Fred Shuttlesworth, because he stood directly in front of the 6 fire hoses and they rolled him down the street. I got behind a tree. And I got wet, but I mean, no, we got back into the church and it was an awful public display, but it really wasn't nearly in the category of the kind of thing that had happened in the Freedom Rides. But now, in the president's favor, he was working behind the scenes the whole while we were in Birmingham. And my job was to go to the Episcopal Church and meet with the business leaders. And we knew that he was meeting with Roger Blau of U.S. Steel and the Hiltons and the hotel industry, the McCrory, Woolworth conglomerates. And he had regular meetings with business leaders of the national chains, trying to get them to lean on their local people. And the amazing thing is that we settled that in that church, and 100 businessmen agreed to desegregate, even though it was still against George Wallace's law. Mm-hmm. And they took down all the signs, they stopped enforcing segregation at the lunch counters, they said they didn't have black people qualified to work as salespersons. And we said, look, the maids you got in the department stores know more about the shops than the clerks do. Ask your wives who they ask for when they want to find something in the shop. And so it was almost too easy, but it was the combination of what was going on in the street. But there was a continuous wave of private pressure that the White House then was very, very good at.
Wasn't there some fear, though, and isn't that one reason that Kennedy acted, and as he did by proposing the Civil Rights Bill? There was some fear that the summer would be very violent in some cities, and the sense was, and even Dr. King felt this, that you could keep making the argument of nonviolence if you showed progress. But when people started to get frustrated and they weren't seeing progress, and at some point Dr. King's message was going to be less powerful. And there was a real fear that the summer of '63, if you didn't show some progress in Washington, might be a very violent one.
I do think that the speech that Kennedy gives in '63, the civil rights speech, I think that speech, perhaps more than any other that he gives in his presidency, demonstrates the power of political eloquence. I mean, obviously the great speech of '63 is the I Have a Dream speech, but I remember listening to Kennedy's speech. Actually, I remember it more than listening to Dr. King's speech, when he talks about this is a question as old as the scriptures. And he also, if you look at it, that speech reflects what we're talking about, how he's come late to the issue. It's a speech about denial, because he says something in that speech, and I can't quote the exact words, but it would catch the imagination of somebody who was 11 years old. He says, until you're willing to change your racial identity, until you're willing to exchange the color of your skin with black citizens in the country, you have to admit that we have a problem. You're denying the truth unless you're willing to do that. And that's exactly, that was a kind of Twilight Zone moment when, you know, at 11 years old, I thought, well, what if I were, and I probably would have said a Negro to myself, what if that were my identity? And the speech, I think, however late he came to the issue, it so identified him with the issue so quickly that it became one of Lyndon Johnson's biggest selling points a year later in getting the Civil Rights Act through. This was President Kennedy's bill. You have to do this. And he identified himself with the issue with words.
Well, we're giving him tremendous moral credit here. Did he really?
I'm sorry, tremendous what?
Moral credit for what he did.
Well, I think
Is that right?
Yeah, because I think he saw it as a moral issue and also a very practical issue. To come back to foreign policy, you know, he was profoundly concerned about the struggle for hearts and minds in the third world, the developing world. And the United States was being beaten on unmercifully for being a racist society, you see. And someone like Lyndon Johnson, to give him some credit too, Johnson understood that most people looked upon the South as the crazy ant you hid in the attic, because it had this bizarre system of segregation, and it was time to change it. And of course, Johnson, with that civil rights and then voting rights bill, it changed that society so dramatically. It has become one of the centers of prosperity in the country. You know, we never could have had a Southern president until that civil rights movement occurred. And look at all the presidents we've had, the two Bushes and Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, Al Gore running from a border state. It's just changed the way in which the nation has dealt with its politics.
And it's going to change even more next year. I think that, you know, 1970 was the year of the New South, when Jimmy Carter and Reuben Askew and Dale Bumpers emerged as Southern governors. But I think we're going to see in 2014, well, the largest college in Georgia is now majority non-white. They are concerned about the health care. They're concerned about their future. You have seen at University of Georgia, at Mississippi State, and University of Alabama, black student government presidents. That's not mandated. The football has integrated everything. You know, I mean, the football teams have just wiped race off the campuses for the most part. Yeah.
Jackie Robinson.
Yeah.
Baseball began it.
Well, now, one of the things that at the very end of the documentary, somebody makes the observation that in 1,000 days, President Kennedy did not carry out very many things, but that he began many things. So he gets a lot of credit for having started the civil rights movement from the federal side. What about things like the war on poverty? You've written about that.
Well, the war on poverty is a very tricky thing to deal with. It was more of a Robert Kennedy thing than a John Kennedy thing. And, you know, in answer to your previous question, I would say more broadly, others maybe can disagree with this, that JFK was not a moralist. RFK was a moralist. They were very different in their approach to politics. So for some reason, Robert Kennedy, it's too complicated to tell here, got from being a crusader against juvenile delinquency in the 50s to being the sort of founder of the war on poverty. Then when JFK died, that got folded into the horrible relationship between Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. So ironically, Lyndon Johnson was the one who declared war on poverty, something I don't think Kennedy would have done and no subsequent president has done, and I think is politically not a smart thing to do because it holds you up for failure later. But then he sort of declared war and said, well, okay, now what do I do? And what was available was this juvenile delinquency program that Robert Kennedy had been working on, so that became the core of the war on poverty with many bizarre consequences. So that's a quick answer. I think it's part of the Robert Kennedy story primarily, not the John Kennedy story.
But it's still the critical issue. When Dr. King started, he said, to redeem the soul of America from the triple evils of racism, war, and poverty. And he was killed trying to raise the issue of poverty. Now, we've sort of lost that whole idea.
Yes.
Because Johnson was continuing the New Deal. Jimmy Carter felt that he wanted to be the president who did for the northern cities what Roosevelt had done for the South. But we've lost touch with economic reality. We're thinking about local problems when this is a global economy that cannot be tamed or cannot be stabilized unless global poverty is somehow addressed. And it doesn't have to be poverty. It can be, let's just take Egypt. Egypt's got an economy that works for 35 million people, but they got 90 million. And China has 500 million people doing well, but they got 1 billion that are in poverty. Poverty is the issue that's been on the table and that's difficult to face, but that's where we are.
You know, Kennedy wanted to include an economic dimension to the Civil Rights Act because he actually thought about, when he was thinking about the challenges for African Americans in the South, he was thinking about their economic disadvantages. Kennedy makes a point. He says, you know, unemployment is not as much of an issue in this country as it should be because it's only about 3.5% among white people, but it was 11% at least among African Americans. He pointed that out. But he had to horse trade. And it's funny in the era we live in today, horse trading doesn't happen very often, does it? When he knew that, he felt that if, I believe from the documents, he never told me, and he wasn't alive, but he felt that nothing would be worse for the civil rights movement in the country than another failed civil rights bill. And so he needed Republican support. And so he went to the leaders of the Republican Party before he finished the bill and said, can you live with this? Because he wanted actually to be able to defeat the filibuster. So he went to the leaders of the Republican Party and he said, and what they couldn't live with was the economic part of it. And he traded it away because he needed public accommodations and he wanted the Attorney General to have some right to launch suits. And there were all kinds of things that he felt were needed. But he said, you know, next time, our next bill is going to be an economic opportunity bill. We're going to do this. He had to trade it away to get Republican support to make it possible to push through the Civil Rights Act.
Go ahead.
But at the same time, I think one of the things that's forgotten about President Kennedy in terms of economics is he was a tax cutter. Just as he was an aggressive anti-communist, he was a tax cutter. He believed in growth. He was not a free spender by any means. And I think that there's been a tendency in the decades that have followed his death to push Kennedy to the left on a lot of things, civil rights in particular, to make him get where he got earlier than he did, more wholeheartedly than he did. But I think that actually applies to economic policy
And
as
on
well.
those issues, a lot of the rhetoric about the new generation was overtly about Eisenhower, but covertly about FDR, and the sort of there was going to be a new kind of democratic liberalism that wasn't the New Deal, and that's where you begin seeing a sort of critique from within the Democratic Party of the New Deal approach to politics.
I think the supply side embrace of John F. Kennedy, which we've also seen, is as hoary and as inappropriate historically.
Well, no, he's not a supply sider, but he was a tax cutter.
He's a tax cutter because I'll tell you, it's for political reasons. It has nothing to do with ideology. He's a tax cutter because the Council of Economic Advisors tells him there's going to be a recession in early 1964. And he does two things. He does one, he says, okay, we're going to cut taxes because the only way we can pump the prime is to do that. And he says, by the way, we're going to have a deficit. I don't like deficits, but we got to do it because we don't want a recession 4 months, 5 months before the election. It has nothing to do, I think, with ideology. It has everything to do with being reelected.
Now, we would all faint dead away at the thought if we actually discussed what taxes were in the era when John Kennedy cut them. Now, I think that it's time for you to catch your plane.
Yeah, I have to go shortly, but before I go, I don't think this discussion should end without something being said about Vietnam, because that had such a searing impact on the long-term experience of this country. And of course, we will never know what John Kennedy would have done about Vietnam. But my supposition is that it would have been very different from what Lyndon Johnson did. He was very skeptical about putting ground troops into that country. Indeed, the whole thrust of that Atlantic article I did, it's called JFK versus the Joint Chiefs. He was skeptical of them. He doubted the wisdom. They were pushing him, my friend Walt Rostow was pushing him like crazy to bomb and send troops into Vietnam as early as 1961. And he just thought it was, no, he didn't want to lose Vietnam. And it had a lot to do with politics, domestic politics, that it would be like Joe McCarthy again, who lost China. He was frightened of that. So what he would have done, none of us will ever know, because I don't think he knew, but I think that he would not have put in massive numbers of ground troops, and it would have been a somewhat different outcome. Maybe he would have bombed, but no, there wouldn't have been that kind of dispatch of hundreds of thousands of troops to Vietnam.
Well, you know, we do have one more clip that we could play, which deals with his wars with the Joint Chiefs. This is about Cuba. It's about the missile crisis, and I think it's very different from what we've been talking about, but it was an extraordinary time. So why don't we watch that?
Okay, and I will.
And you can quietly slip away. Thank you so much.
What you see in the Cuban Missile Crisis is Jack Kennedy pulling the nation back from the edge of war. And you know, we're talking here about nuclear war.
Kennedy made one overriding calculation: that Nikita Khrushchev was as horrified at the prospect of nuclear Armageddon as he was. The president let that calculation, his alone, be his guide, and he gambled on it.
He gave Khrushchev space. He gave him space when other people were unwilling to give him any space at all.
Kennedy had already pulled back the quarantine line to delay confrontation. And on October 25th, against the advice of the ex-com, he instructed the Navy to allow a Soviet oil tanker to breach the quarantine and enter the port in Havana. But on the 12th day of the crisis, Saturday, October 27th, things started to go awry.
Black Saturday was probably the day the world came closer than ever before or since to a nuclear war. Many things started happening on Black Saturday, including a U-2 spy plane stumbling over the Soviet Union, which Kennedy reacted to that by saying, there's always some son of a bitch that doesn't get the word. Both leaders, Khrushchev and Kennedy, were beginning to lose control over their own forces.
The Soviets seemed intent on testing the quarantine line that Saturday. A U.S. ship dropped depth charges on a Soviet submarine in the Caribbean. And, most harrowing, an American spy plane on a mission over Cuba fell off the radar.
You hear the moment on the tape. A messenger comes into the room. You hear Jack Kennedy. For a moment, he's flustered.
The U-2 was shot down. The fire against our low-altitude surveillance shut down. Yes, Raj just said it was not shut down.
We have said that if Russia shoots down one of our U-2 reconnaissance planes, we will immediately retaliate. We'll immediately bomb that missile site that took out the plane. And then we will prepare for an all-out invasion. And you hear in the background this chorus of voices. We said we will retaliate. We have to do it right now.
You retaliate against the stand side, I don't know. If any of the plane fired up, it looks like a degree too shaped. It looked good there. It still looks good to me.
You know what Kennedy says? He says, well, let's take a break, gentlemen. Time and again, when the hawks in that room, when the Joint Chiefs of Staff are insisting on invading, Kennedy pulls them back. He says, let's go to dinner now and talk about, the Jupiter missiles. Let's talk about a trade.
Kennedy could see the chance for a peaceful solution was slipping away. So he chose the person he most trusted, Brother Bobby, to take an urgent message to the Soviet ambassador in Washington. He was proposing a way out, which involved the U.S. giving up a set of redundant weapons, the newly installed Jupiter missiles in Turkey.
Kennedy repeats his demand for Khrushchev to pull out, says that time is of the essence. If Khrushchev pulls his missiles out of Cuba, the U.S. will, over the next few weeks, pull its missiles out of Turkey. The president was willing to back down, pull out the American missiles from Turkey, but only if that was kept secret.
The Strategic Air Command bombers are circling over the Arctic waiting for the go signals. Other bombers in the United States, they're being handed their target packets to bomb Russia the next day. In Florida, the 5th Marine Expeditionary Force is readying for the invasion. An invasion, war. If Russia's drawn into it, and it will be, these are Russians on Cuba, nuclear war.
This is Radio Moscow. Premier Khrushchev has sent a message to President Kennedy today. The Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
Khrushchev accepts, and he signs his telegram, with respect, Khrushchev.
Progress is now being made towards the restoration of peace in the Caribbean, and it is our firm hope and purpose that this progress shall go forward. We will continue to keep the American people informed on this vital matter. Thank you.
The outcome of the missile crisis was more than dumb luck. I think had somebody else been in the White House at that point as president, the outcome could have been very different. I don't want to praise the president too much. I think he made many blunders, but he managed to get the Soviet missiles removed from Cuba, and he did so without triggering a nuclear war. It was not self-evident that that would happen.
Did he do a victory dance in public after Khrushchev withdrew the missiles? No. And he was very explicit about why not, and he said it to his team. Don't embarrass him, don't humiliate him. We won. It's good enough.
Now, I don't know how many of you remember that night, the Black Friday, but I was in college here in Boston and in the Boston area, And I remember when they activated the big SAC wing and it was flying down the coast, you could hear those planes roaring all night long. It was completely terrifying. I think we all thought that we were going to war. And it was nuclear war, obviously. Now, this was, it seems to me, to be the president that John Kennedy thought he was going to be, the foreign policy president. What did you think when you saw that president?
You mean, well, the president is depicted. It's really important we were talking about how President Kennedy went against the advice of most all of his advisors, except for Harris Wofford, and I think I should have mentioned Sergeant Shriver. He also thought the call to Coretta Scott King was important to make. He goes against almost every advisor again at this moment, and they tell him, if you in any way indicate to Khrushchev that you would give in on the Turkish missiles and make the trade, you're going to undermine all of our post-war alliances. And that's what McGeorge Bundy, his national security advisor, tells him. And it's on the tape. It's an incredible moment, because when you're president, people are used to telling you that they agree with you. So he asked them, do you all agree? And you hear, and then one by one, they start to make little arguments for history about why he shouldn't do it. And he overrode them, and he sent his brother to see Dobrynin. I think that there is a very private tribal history to the Kennedy years that involves the brothers. And it's amazing to me still, when the Cold War ended and the Soviets opened some of their materials, it's gotten really restrictive since, in the last 10 years. But we saw that Robert Kennedy, on behalf of his brother, went to the Soviets in 1961 and offered some new proposals to get a test ban, a comprehensive test ban, which, by the way, we still haven't achieved. If that had leaked, if that had ever leaked, John F. Kennedy would have been finished. Think of the era. The President of the United States is using his brother, the Attorney General, to offer a proposal which is not the State Department's proposal. It's far more liberal, in order to obtain a comprehensive test ban. The President had a sense that he could do business with Moscow, and I don't know where that came from. I wish I could tell you. But he had this sense from the day he was inaugurated. And Bobby met, I should say Bobby, I don't know, the Attorney General met on several occasions with Russian representatives in deniable places to make various proposals about test bans, about Laos, about Cuba, all of which would have gotten Kennedy in tremendous political trouble if that had ever leaked. It didn't. But what it showed was that Kennedy thought he could make this relationship work. What happens in 1962 is that Khrushchev lied to him. And so not only had he been taking this political risk for over a year, but he realized to himself that he might have totally misunderstood the Soviets. That's what makes the Cuban Missile Crisis psychologically even more traumatic for him, because he has privately, secretly with his brother, been trying to be an architect of a new kind of Soviet-American relationship, and Khrushchev has now given him the bird, and he doesn't know what to do.
Nick, you want to?
I just would add to this, just pulling up something that you said and is in the film. Remember the tenor of the times, and remember, the Turkish missile part. I don't remember when that came out, but it's a fascinating aspect that they felt they couldn't announce we did this and got peace, because it would make them seem weak. In Bobby Kennedy's own book, I believe it's not in there.
It is there.
It is.
But it is there. We're talking about 13 days. But it's not in Arthur Schlesinger's 1,000 Days.
Right, that's right.
And it's amazing. And by the way, The Russians never leaked it.
So there's this fear
The
of
Russians never leaked it.
There's this pervasive fear of seeming soft that you really have to work to feel your way into, because it's so much not part of where the country is at this moment.
Well, take a look at 1,000 Days, that lyrical history of President Kennedy's administration, and look at how Arthur Schlesinger treats Vietnam in 1965, and look at how Arthur Schlesinger treats Vietnam in his biography of Robert F. Kennedy. He's writing about the same period, and yet somehow the nuances are different.
You're right.
I would, I want to recommend, and there are many wonderful things in this Atlantic issue, the special issue, but one of the most hair-raising ones is the discussion of what the Joint Chiefs were saying. I mean, they were right on the edge of nuclear war, and they wanted to go over the edge, and he was just, horrified by it, and very much afraid that he wouldn't be able to back them down, and that they actually had the authority at that time to initiate nuclear war without him. And I mean, these are things that, you completely, I don't suppose I ever knew that.
One of the things that's most secret in our government is when we would use nuclear weapons. Among the things that is declassified years later, and it's only in the last couple of years that we've actually learned where nuclear weapons might be used at different times. And John Kennedy learned this. He didn't have to wait 50 years. He learned this within a few weeks of arriving on the job. It scared the daylights out of him, because they were ready to use nuclear weapons against China. The
they were
American
ready to use nuclear weapons against Cuba?
But in 1961 against China.
Unbelievable.
Forget about Cuba over the Laos question. And Kennedy realized that we had a hair trigger. We had a hair trigger there for the use of nuclear weapons, which was the product of Eisenhower's massive retaliation approach to defending the United States. And he thought it was stupid, and it was risky, and he wasn't going to live with it. But he was up against a military leadership that had endorsed it because they'd all been chosen by Eisenhower. So he had to change our entire country's approach to national security with the same military leaders in place, because if he started firing them, he didn't have the political clout to survive it. So he had to basically retire them. And you'll notice they keep disappearing, but they don't go fast enough.
There's one thing that I connect to this, that Khrushchev's interpreter was the son of the first Russian ambassador. Oh. And he actually went to high school at Sidwell Friends and went to college at Swarthmore. And he was the Russian ambassador when I was at the UN. And we became real buddies and played tennis every month. And I never had a Soviet veto, but the thing was, the thing is that there are personal connections behind the scenes in Washington that we don't know enough about. But Troianovsky was sensitive enough to American politics to give his bosses, at least let them know you can't push these folk too far. You've got to give your opponent a face-saving way out.
So both of them were doing that.
And that was true in race relations as it is in foreign policy.
So if everybody gets to have 20 seconds, what do you think is what's your pronouncement 50 years out of this rookie president, as they called him in the beginning of the film? This rookie president, what do you think?
I think memory being what it is, in the public imagination, the personal glamour of John F. Kennedy is what will survive. And I hate saying this, but more than anything, the assassination. The personal legendary quality. Professional historians, I don't know how they'll rank him. I suspect they'll rank him pretty well. But we cannot see President Kennedy through any other prism but what happened in November of 1963. And I think that will loom even larger.
Well,
Mr. Ambassador?
I refuse to do that.
Okay.
Because I think that he glamorized leadership, putting a man on the moon, the Peace Corps. I run into African leaders all over the place that came to this country as part of that Kennedy airlift. Well, President Obama's father was that he had an impact on the world that we will never understand fully. But it was because he was genuine. You say he wasn't a moralist. I say it's impossible to grow up a Catholic and not, and not be moral. I mean, you say too many Hail Marys. and so, but he was not a religious ideologue. But in terms of well, I just think we were blessed because he was the one who kind of set the stage for the world as we have it now.
The CIA came to him with a list of covert operations, and he was reading it. It's on a tape. Somehow got declassified. Thank God. And he's saying, to defend our free market system abroad. Are you kidding? What are we talking about here? John Kennedy was deliciously skeptical. The reason he's so much fun to study is that he's really smart. And he's just not capable of can't. I don't mean cannot. I mean of just nonsense of everything is, his mind is in flux. That's why he's so, by the way, difficult for those people who'd like to say what he would have done in his second term. Because I agree with, I agree with Bob Dallek. I think he hadn't made up his mind about Vietnam. But he's a skeptic. He thinks outside the box. He's a pragmatist. I don't think it's a bad thing to be a pragmatist, because just because you're a pragmatist doesn't mean you don't have values. And so I guess his biggest flaw as a decision maker, and it's not such a bad one, is that he actually thought there were solutions to every problem. And sometimes there aren't.
No, that was longer than 20 seconds.
I'm sorry I talked too much. I'm sorry.
Let me try quickly a couple of observations. First, one reason it's hard to answer the question is there was this chain of events. Johnson would never have been president had Kennedy not made him vice president. Had Kennedy not been assassinated, there wouldn't have been this overwhelming mood that let Johnson pass a whole lot of liberal legislation that then ramified through another generation or two, and including in the mix of that, the Kennedy family moved way to the left of where they had been and stayed there. So it's very hard to do the what-ifs on that, because I do see John F. Kennedy as a moderate, centrist, pragmatist liberal, but that strain got blown up when he was killed. One other quick thing is the point made in the first clip you showed. This is the beginning of a long run that we're probably still in of the end of consensus politics, the end of organizational politics, the beginning of a whole bunch of other stuff, media politics, grassroots politics, et cetera. And that's a really important change in kind of how the country works, which I can't get into in 20 seconds.
So, but you're suggesting that it's not so much a question of specific things that he started, but that he just, because of him, we are on different paths.
He changed the way politics is practiced in ways that turned out to be fairly permanent up till now. In the policy sense, I'm painting with a very broad brush here, he made moves in a direction that you can describe as coherent that then became tidal waves in every instance in the hands of Johnson and the national grief. And so that's why it's hard to figure where things would have gone in the policy sense had Kennedy not been killed.
Sure, we've been very lucky tonight to be here with so many thoughtful people. Thank you all very much.